somewhere in the quiet stretch between certainty and curiosity, there's a story we all think we already understand. It's a story that has been told so many times, in classrooms, documentaries, and history books, that it feels almost settled, finished, complete. A moment frozen in time. A grainy black and white image of a human footprint pressed into fine grey dust. A voice, calm and measured, echoing across nearly 400,000 kilometers of empty space. A sentence that became part of human memory itself. And yet, if you sit with it long enough, if you slow it down and begin to look at the details rather than the headline, something interesting starts to happen. Because the moon landing is not just a moment. It's a collection of thousands of decisions, technologies, risks, and unknowns, all compressed into a few hours in July of 1969. And when you look closely, it becomes less like a finished story and more like something still quietly unfolding. Before we go deeper, take a second. Wherever you are right now, maybe lying in bed, maybe half awake, maybe just letting your mind drift. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and if you feel like it, let me know where you're listening from. It's always interesting to see how far these conversations travel, even if tonight we're talking about a journey that went much farther, because tonight we're not here to prove anything. We're here to examine, to slow things down, to take one of the most famous events in human history and gently turn it in the light, looking at what we know, what we assume, and where the edges begin to blur. The mainstream story is clear and in many ways remarkable. In the 1960s, during the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a competition that extended beyond Earth itself. It wasn't just about territory or influence. It was about demonstrating technological superiority, proving what each system was capable of achieving. And space became the ultimate stage for that demonstration. The Soviet Union struck first with early victories, launching the first satellite, the first human in orbit. And for a moment, it seemed like they were ahead in a race that few fully understood. But then, a bold goal was announced: to land a human on the moon and bring them safely back to Earth. Not someday, within the decade. From that point forward, the effort intensified. Massive rockets were designed and built. Entire new fields of engineering were pushed forward. Computers, primitive by today's standards, were developed and trusted with life or death calculations. Thousands of people worked together toward a single objective, many of them never seeing the full picture, only their small part of the system. And eventually, in July 1969, it happened. A spacecraft entered lunar orbit. A small module separated and descended toward the surface. 2 astronauts stepped onto the moon, collected samples, conducted experiments, and returned safely to Earth. The mission was broadcast to millions of people watching in real time, across continents and cultures. From this perspective, it feels definitive. A triumph of human ingenuity. A moment where technology, determination, and timing aligned perfectly. But as with many things that seem complete, the closer you look, the more questions begin to form. Not necessarily contradictions, but areas where the story becomes more complex. For example, consider the technological context. In 1969, computers were far less powerful than the devices we carry in our pockets today. Memory was measured in kilobytes, not gigabytes. Processing speeds were limited. And yet, these systems were trusted to guide a spacecraft across space, calculate orbital mechanics, and manage critical landing procedures on an entirely different celestial body. The mainstream explanation is that these systems were incredibly specialized, designed for a single purpose, and supported by human oversight, both on the spacecraft and from mission control. And that's true. The Apollo guidance computer, for instance, was a marvel of its time. Efficient, reliable, and built with redundancy in mind. But when you pause and reflect on it, it raises an interesting question. Not, was it possible? Because clearly, something did happen. But rather, how much of that success relied on precision? And how much relied on calculated risk? Because the margin for error was incredibly small. And that leads us into another layer of the story, the human element. The astronauts themselves were not just passengers. They were pilots, engineers, decision makers. During the descent to the moon's surface, unexpected issues occurred. Alarms triggered. The landing site turned out to be more hazardous than anticipated. At one point, manual control was required to avoid a dangerous area filled with rocks and craters. Fuel levels dropped, time compressed, and yet, a safe landing was achieved. From the mainstream perspective, this demonstrates the skill and training of the astronauts, combined with the support of mission control. It's a testament to preparation and adaptability, but it also introduces a subtle tension. Because when systems become that complex, when so many variables interact at once, it becomes difficult to fully reconstruct every detail after the fact. Not impossible, but layered. And this is where alternative perspectives often begin, not necessarily from disbelief, but from curiosity about those layers. For instance, the photographic evidence. We've all seen the images, astronauts standing on the lunar surface, flags planted in the ground, the stark contrast between light and shadow. These images are often cited as proof of the mission, and for good reason. They provide visual documentation of the environment, the equipment, and the astronauts themselves. The mainstream explanation for how these photos were captured involves specially designed cameras, adapted for use in extreme conditions. The lighting conditions on the moon, without an atmosphere to scatter light, create sharp contrasts and unusual visual effects. Shadows appear darker. The sky appears completely black, even during the lunar day. And yet, when people examine these images closely, they sometimes notice details that feel unfamiliar. The way shadows fall at slightly different angles, the absence of visible stars, the behavior of dust when disturbed. None of these observations, on their own, disprove anything. In fact, most of them have well-documented explanations rooted in physics and optics. But they do something else. They invite people to look closer, to ask, why does it look like that? And that question, in itself, is not unreasonable, because the moon is an environment we don't experience directly. Our expectations are based on Earth, where light behaves differently, where air scatters brightness, where perspective is softened by atmosphere. Remove those familiar conditions, and the result can feel almost artificial, even when it isn't. And so, what begins as a simple observation can evolve into a broader curiosity. Not necessarily a rejection of the event, but a deeper examination of how it was documented. Then there's the question of communication. In 1969, transmitting live video from the moon to Earth was an extraordinary technical challenge. The signal had to travel vast distances, be received by ground stations, processed, and broadcast to televisions around the world. The footage we have today is not a direct recording of the original transmission. It's a recording of a broadcast, which itself was processed from the original signal. Over time, some of the highest quality original recordings were lost or overwritten, which has added another layer of complexity to how the event is preserved. The mainstream explanation is practical: storage limitations, data management practices of the time, and the assumption that the broadcast recordings were sufficient for historical purposes. But again, it introduces a subtle question, not about whether the event happened, but about how much of it we can still see, exactly as it was. And that distinction matters, because history is not just about events, it's about records. And when records are incomplete or filtered through multiple layers of processing, they can feel distant, almost like echoes rather than direct experiences. And maybe that's where the moon landing exists for many people today, not as a clear, immediate event, but as something slightly out of reach, something we know happened. And yet, when we try to fully grasp it, we find ourselves relying on fragments, interpretations, and reconstructions. So tonight, as we begin this journey, we're not trying to solve the moon landing. We're not here to confirm or deny. We're here to explore the edges, to look at what we know, and gently examine the places where certainty fades into curiosity. Because sometimes, the most interesting part of a story isn't the conclusion, it's the space just before it, the moment where you pause and think. Wait, how exactly did that work? As you let that question settle, not as doubt, but as curiosity, it becomes easier to notice something that often gets overlooked in stories like this. The moon landing wasn't just a single moment of success. It was the final result of a long chain of attempts, many of which didn't go as planned. Before July 1969, there were years of testing, failures, partial successes, and quiet adjustments. Rockets exploded on launch pads. Guidance systems malfunctioned. Missions were aborted mid-flight. Each step forward was built on previous mistakes, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden behind technical reports and internal reviews. The mainstream understanding acknowledges this clearly. The Apollo program was not smooth. It was iterative, sometimes chaotic, and often dangerous. The tragic loss of the Apollo 1 crew during a ground test is a stark reminder of how unforgiving this kind of engineering can be. That event alone forced a complete redesign of critical systems, from materials used in the cabin to emergency procedures. And yet, when we look back, the narrative often compresses all of that complexity into a single, clean arc. Failure, followed by triumph. But if we slow that down and resist the urge to simplify, something more interesting begins to emerge. Because each failure wasn't just a setback, it was data, information about what didn't work, and sometimes about what almost worked. And that almost is worth paying attention to. Take the Saturn V rocket, for example. It remains one of the most powerful machines ever built, even by today's standards. The engineering behind it was extraordinary, but also incredibly complex. Thousands of components, each needing to function correctly, all interacting in real time. The mainstream explanation is that this complexity was managed through rigorous testing, redundancy, and careful design. Systems were built to tolerate certain failures without catastrophic consequences. But complexity has a way of behaving, unpredictably, not always in obvious ways. Sometimes in subtle interactions between systems that were never fully anticipated. And this raises an interesting thought, not a contradiction, but a perspective. When something that complex works perfectly on one of the most important missions ever attempted, what does that actually tell us? Does it reflect complete control over the system? Or does it reflect a moment where everything aligned just enough, at just the right time? Because in engineering, there's a quiet understanding that success doesn't always mean total certainty. Sometimes it means that all the known risks were managed, and all the unknown risks simply didn't manifest. At least, not in a way that caused failure. And that distinction matters, because it introduces a layer of humility into the story. It suggests that the moon landing wasn't just a demonstration of mastery, but also a moment where risk, preparation, and timing intersected in a very specific way. Now, let's shift slightly, not away from the facts, but toward how those facts were experienced by the world. Because the moon landing wasn't just an engineering event, it was a broadcast, a global moment, shared in real time, or at least something very close to it. Millions of people watched as the events unfolded. Families gathered around televisions. Radios carried the voices of astronauts and mission control across continents. For many, it felt like humanity itself was stepping onto the moon, and that shared experience is important because it shaped how the event was perceived and remembered. The mainstream explanation emphasizes transparency. The mission was not hidden. It was followed closely by journalists, scientists, and international observers. Data was shared. Images were released. Samples brought back from the moon were studied by researchers around the world, including those outside the United States. All of this supports the idea that the event was not only real, but openly documented. But when something becomes a global spectacle, it also becomes something else, a narrative. Not in the sense of fiction, but in the sense of structure. Events are framed, moments are highlighted, certain details are emphasized, while others remain in the background. This isn't necessarily intentional, it's simply how human communication works. We focus on what feels most significant, most symbolic, a footprint, a flag, a sentence spoken at the exact right moment. And over time, these elements become the story. But the full reality, the thousands of smaller details, the technical nuances, the moments of uncertainty, they become less visible, not lost, but quieter. And this creates an interesting space, because when people revisit the moon landing decades later, they're often encountering the narrative version first, not the full technical record. And when they begin to look deeper, when they notice details that weren't part of the original narrative, it can feel like discovering something new, even if that information was always there, just not widely emphasized. For example, consider the timeline. After the first moon landing in 1969, there were several more missions. Astronauts returned to the lunar surface multiple times, conducted experiments, explored different regions, and brought back more samples. And then, the mission stopped. By 1972, the program had ended. No humans have returned to the moon since. The mainstream explanation is grounded in practical considerations. The goals of the program had been achieved. Public interest began to decline. Funding shifted toward other priorities, including space stations and robotic exploration. And that explanation makes sense. But it also raises a quiet question. Not about the first landing, but about what came after. If humanity had developed the capability to travel to the moon, land, and return safely, why wasn't that capability sustained? Why does it feel, in some ways, like a door that opened briefly and then closed? There are technical answers to this. The infrastructure required for those missions was enormous and expensive. The Saturn V rockets were not reused. The knowledge was documented, but the exact manufacturing processes, the specific configurations, they were part of a system that no longer existed in the same form. Rebuilding that capability isn't as simple as repeating a set of instructions. It requires recreating an entire ecosystem of technology, expertise, and resources. And yet, from a distance, it can feel unusual, almost like reaching a milestone and then stepping back from it, not because it wasn't real, but because sustaining it required a level of commitment that shifted over time. And this is where the conversation often begins to drift into more speculative territory, not because the facts are unclear, but because the interpretation of those facts can vary. Some people see the moon landing as a peak moment of human achievement, followed by a natural transition into other areas of exploration. Others see it as something more contained, a project shaped by a specific moment in history, the Cold War, where urgency drove rapid progress, and once that urgency faded, so did the momentum. Neither perspective necessarily contradicts the other, but they frame the story differently. One emphasizes continuity, the other highlights the uniqueness of that moment, and maybe that's where the deeper curiosity lies, not in questioning whether the moon landing happened, but in understanding why it happened when it did, and why it hasn't happened again in quite the same way. Because when you step back and look at the broader pattern, it starts to feel less like a simple progression and more like a spike, a sudden rise in capability, followed by a long plateau. And that pattern appears in other areas of history as well. Moments where technology leaps forward, driven by specific conditions, and then stabilizes or even retreats when those conditions change. So as we continue, we're going to keep moving through these layers, not rushing, not jumping to conclusions, just observing carefully. Because the moon landing is not just a question of what happened, it's a question of how we understand what happened and how that understanding evolves over time. And the more we explore it, the more we might notice that the story is not as fixed as it first appears, not because it's uncertain, but because it's deeper than it seems. As we continue, slowly, letting each layer settle before moving to the next, it becomes clear that one of the most fascinating aspects of the moon landing is not just what was achieved, but how it was visually captured. Because for most people, the moon landing is not something they experienced directly, it's something they saw. Or perhaps more accurately, something they saw representations of, photographs, video footage, broadcast transmissions, reproductions of those originals, copied, compressed, enhanced, and sometimes degraded over decades. And in a way, that makes the moon landing not just a physical event, but a visual one. An event defined, at least in part, by how it looked. The mainstream explanation for the imagery is detailed and technical. The cameras used on the lunar surface were specially designed for extreme conditions, vacuum, temperature fluctuations, and harsh lighting. The most well-known were the Hasselblad cameras, modified for space use, with large film formats that allowed for incredibly high-resolution images. These cameras were mounted to the astronauts' suits, meaning that many of the photos were taken without looking directly through a viewfinder. Instead, framing relied on training, body positioning, and estimation. And when you look at the resulting images, they are, in many cases, remarkably well composed. Clear horizons, balanced subjects, crisp details. From the mainstream perspective, this speaks to the extensive preparation and practice the astronauts underwent. They trained in simulated environments, practiced movements, learned how to operate equipment under constraints that would feel unfamiliar to most of us. But when you pause on that detail, just for a moment, it invites a quiet question, not a challenge, but an observation. How did astronauts, operating in bulky suits under unfamiliar gravity, without direct visual framing, manage to capture such consistently clear and well-composed images? Again, there are reasonable explanations: training, repetition, selection. Many photos were taken, and the best ones are the ones most often shown. Over time, what we see is a curated subset of a much larger collection. And yet, that sense of precision, that clarity, it contributes to something subtle. The images feel almost intentional, not staged, but composed in a way that aligns closely with how we expect important moments to look. And this brings us to lighting. Because lighting on the moon behaves very differently from lighting on Earth. Without an atmosphere, there is no scattering of light. Shadows are sharp, almost absolute. Areas in direct sunlight are extremely bright, while shaded regions can appear almost completely black. The sun becomes the dominant light source, creating high-contrast scenes that can feel unfamiliar to our eyes. The mainstream explanation accounts for many of the visual characteristics we see. The absence of stars in most photos, for example, is due to exposure settings. The cameras were adjusted for the bright lunar surface, making faint stars effectively invisible. Shadows appearing at slightly different angles can be explained by uneven terrain, perspective distortion, and the wide-angle lenses used on the cameras. All of this is grounded in physics. And yet, when people first encounter these explanations, there's often a moment of adjustment, because the images don't behave the way our intuition expects. And when intuition and reality don't immediately align, curiosity fills the gap. For example, the way light reflects off the lunar surface. Moon dust, regolith, is not like sand on Earth. It's fine, almost powder-like, and has reflective properties that can scatter light in subtle ways. This can illuminate areas that would otherwise appear darker, creating a kind of soft fill effect, even in the absence of an atmosphere. To someone unfamiliar with this behavior, it can look like there are multiple light sources. But in reality, it's a combination of direct sunlight and reflected light from the surface itself. Still, it's not something we experience in everyday life, and so it feels slightly off. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. And that feeling is important, because much of the discussion around the moon landing, both mainstream and alternative, centers not on clear contradictions, but on moments where expectation and observation don't perfectly match, where something looks unusual and invites a closer look. Now, let's move to motion. Not the still images, but the footage. The way astronauts move on the moon is one of the most distinctive aspects of the landing. The lower gravity, about 1/6 of Earth's, creates a kind of slow, bounding motion. Steps become hops. Movements appear lighter, almost exaggerated in their arc. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Reduced gravity changes how mass and inertia interact, allowing for movements that would be difficult or impossible on Earth. And when you watch the footage, it's consistent with that explanation. But here again, perception plays a role, because the footage we see today is not always presented exactly as it was originally captured. Frame rates, playback speeds, and broadcast conversions have changed over time. Some footage appears slightly smoother or slightly more abrupt, depending on how it was processed. And this introduces another layer, not about what happened, but about how what happened is represented. If a video is slightly sped up or slowed down, even unintentionally, it can subtly alter how motion is perceived. A movement might appear more fluid or more staged, depending on those small differences. The mainstream view acknowledges these technical factors, and they are well documented. But for someone encountering the footage without that context, it can feel ambiguous. Again, not incorrect, but open to interpretation, and that pattern keeps repeating. Details that are explainable, but not always immediately intuitive. Now, let's consider something even more subtle. Sound, or rather, the absence of it. On the moon, there is no atmosphere to carry sound waves. This means that, outside of the astronauts' suits, the environment is completely silent. The only sounds we hear in recordings are those transmitted through communication systems. Voices, breathing, occasional static. From the mainstream perspective, this is exactly what we would expect. But when we watch the footage, our brains often try to fill in the missing sensory information. We imagine what it would sound like, the crunch of boots on dust, the movement of equipment. And when those sounds aren't present, it creates a kind of disconnect, a quiet that feels almost unnatural. Because on Earth, silence is rarely absolute. There's always something: wind, distant noise, subtle vibrations. But on the moon, there is nothing. And that nothingness is difficult to fully grasp. So what we're seeing, over and over again, is not a series of contradictions, but a series of unfamiliar conditions. Conditions that produce results which, while physically accurate, don't always align with our everyday experience. And that gap between expectation and reality is where curiosity grows. Not necessarily skepticism, but attention. A desire to understand why something looks the way it does. And maybe that's one of the most interesting aspects of the moon landing. It forces us to confront environments that don't behave like our own. It reminds us that our intuition is shaped by Earth, and that beyond it, things can feel strange, even when they are completely real. So as we move forward, we'll continue to explore these details, not to unravel the story, but to understand it more fully. Because sometimes, the closer you look at something familiar, the more unfamiliar it becomes. And in that space, between recognition and surprise, there's always something worth noticing. As we continue, letting each piece settle into place, it becomes harder to ignore a deeper layer beneath all of this. Something less about images or motion, and more about trust. Because at its core, the moon landing is not just something we analyze through photos or footage. It's something we accept through a network of institutions, experts, engineers, and systems working together. And that raises a quiet but important idea. Most of what we know about the moon landing, we know because we trust the process that produced that knowledge. The mainstream explanation is built on that trust, but not blindly. It rests on a structure of verification. Thousands of scientists and engineers were involved. Data was shared internationally. Independent tracking stations, including those outside the United States, monitored the missions. Lunar samples brought back were studied across the world, their composition consistent with what we would expect from a body like the moon. These layers form a kind of web, where each part supports the others. And in that sense, the moon landing is not just one claim. It's many interconnected claims, all reinforcing a single conclusion. But when you step back and look at that structure, another question quietly appears. Not, is it true, but how do we know it's true? Because most people didn't witness the landing firsthand. They didn't see the spacecraft leave Earth with their own eyes, track it across space, and watch it land on the moon. Instead, they experienced it through layers of mediation, television broadcasts, photographs, reports, explanations. And for the vast majority of human knowledge, that's normal. We rely on systems of expertise all the time. We trust that bridges are safe, that planes are engineered correctly, that medicines do what they're designed to do. Not because we personally verify every detail, but because the systems behind them are robust, tested, and accountable. And the moon landing fits into that same pattern. But it also stands apart, because it's not something we encounter regularly. We don't see moon landings happen every year. We don't have ongoing, everyday experiences that reinforce it in the same way we do with other technologies. It's a singular event, or rather, a series of events that occurred in a specific window of time. And that makes it feel distant, almost like something we inherit rather than something we continuously observe. Now, let's consider the lunar samples. This is often one of the strongest pieces of evidence cited in the mainstream understanding. Hundreds of kilograms of material were brought back from the moon during the Apollo missions. These samples have been studied extensively, revealing compositions that differ in key ways from Earth rocks, particularly in their isotopic ratios and lack of certain weathering processes. Scientists from multiple countries have examined these samples, and their findings align with what we know about lunar geology from independent observations. From this perspective, the samples act as physical confirmation, not just images or data, but something tangible. And yet, even here, there's an interesting nuance, because for most people, These samples are not directly accessible. They exist in laboratories, institutions, controlled environments. We know about them through published studies, through expert analysis, through a chain of communication that translates physical material into shared knowledge. Again, this is normal, but it reinforces that underlying idea. That much of what we accept is mediated through trust in systems. And when those systems are working well, that trust feels invisible. We don't think about it. We simply accept the result. But when something feels unusual, or when curiosity is triggered, that trust becomes more visible. We start to ask questions, not necessarily because something is wrong, but because we want to understand how the system holds together. Now, let's shift slightly to the geopolitical context. Because the moon landing didn't happen in isolation. It happened during one of the most tense periods in modern history, the Cold War. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, competing not just militarily, but technologically, ideologically, symbolically. Space was more than exploration. It was a demonstration, a way to show the world what each side was capable of achieving. The mainstream explanation acknowledges this fully. The space race was driven by competition, by the desire to reach milestones first, to claim a kind of leadership beyond Earth itself. And in that context, the moon landing becomes even more significant, because it wasn't just a scientific achievement, it was a statement. But here's where it gets interesting. The Soviet Union, despite being a rival, never formally disputed the moon landing. They tracked the missions. They had the capability to monitor signals, to observe launches, to analyze what was happening. And yet, they did not present evidence to contradict the event. From the mainstream perspective, this is a powerful point. If the landing had been fabricated, it's likely that a geopolitical rival would have exposed it, especially given the stakes at the time. But if we slow that down and look at it more carefully, it opens another line of thought. Not a contradiction, but a question about incentives. Because international dynamics are complex. What one nation chooses to challenge or not challenge can depend on many factors beyond simple truth or falsehood. Strategic priorities, internal challenges, political calculations. All of these can influence how information is handled. So the absence of a challenge doesn't necessarily prove anything on its own, but combined with other evidence, it becomes part of a larger pattern. And that's what we keep returning to. Patterns. Not single pieces of evidence, but how multiple pieces fit together. Now, consider communication delays. Signals traveling between Earth and the Moon take time, about 1.3 seconds each way. This creates a noticeable delay in conversations between astronauts and mission control. And if you listen carefully to the recordings, that delay is present. Responses are not immediate. There's a rhythm to the communication that reflects the physical distance. From the mainstream perspective, this is exactly what we would expect, but it also serves as a kind of subtle anchor, a detail that grounds the event in physical reality. Because it's not something that would be easy to simulate perfectly, especially in real time, with the technology available at the time. And yet, even here, the pattern holds. Each detail, on its own, can be explained. Each piece fits within a framework, but understanding that framework requires stepping back, seeing how all the elements connect, and recognizing that no single detail tells the whole story. So where does that leave us? Not with a conclusion, but with a deeper appreciation of the complexity. Because the moon landing is not just a question of did it happen? It's a question of how a vast network of technology, human effort, documentation, and interpretation comes together to create something we accept as history. And when you begin to see it that way, it becomes less like a single event and more like a system, a system that produced an outcome, a system that recorded that outcome, and a system that continues to explain that outcome decades later. And maybe, just maybe, the most interesting part of that system is not where it's strongest, but where it's most subtle. The quiet places, where things are assumed rather than examined. Because those are the places where curiosity tends to linger. Not loudly, but persistently. Like a question that doesn't demand an answer. Only attention. As we move deeper into this, letting the surface level familiarity of the story slowly give way to something more detailed, more textured, it becomes impossible to ignore one of the most discussed and often misunderstood elements of the moon landing, the environment itself. Because everything we've talked about so far, images, motion, communication, systems of trust, they all exist within a setting that is profoundly different from anything we experience on Earth. And when you truly begin to picture that setting, not just as an idea, but as a physical reality, it starts to shift how the entire event feels. The moon is not just a distant object in the sky. It is a place of extremes. No atmosphere, no weather, no sound. Temperatures that swing dramatically depending on whether you are in sunlight or shadow. In direct sunlight, the surface can become intensely hot. In shadow, it can drop to temperatures far below anything naturally experienced on Earth. And yet, in the middle of this environment, humans walked, calmly, methodically, carrying out tasks, setting up experiments, collecting samples, moving across terrain that had never been touched before. The mainstream explanation for how this was possible lies in the design of the suits and equipment. The spacesuits were not just clothing, they were self-contained life support systems. They regulated temperature, provided oxygen, removed carbon dioxide, protected against radiation to some degree, and allowed for mobility despite their bulk. And when you look at them, they are impressive, layered, reflective, carefully engineered, but also restrictive. Movement is not natural. Every step requires effort. Every motion is slightly resisted by the structure of the suit. And yet, the astronauts adapted. They developed a way of moving that worked within those constraints, a kind of controlled, rhythmic hopping that conserved energy and maintained balance in low gravity. From the mainstream perspective, this is a testament to human adaptability. But if you slow down and really sit with that image, it becomes something else, something almost surreal. Two humans, inside complex mechanical systems, moving across a silent, airless world, with Earth hanging in the sky behind them. And that surreal quality is important, because it reminds us that even when something is real, it can still feel unfamiliar. Now, let's focus on the lunar surface itself. Regolith, the fine dust covering the moon, is unlike anything we commonly encounter. It's formed not by wind or water erosion, but by billions of years of micrometeorite impacts. Tiny fragments, sharp-edged, almost glass-like in some cases. When astronauts walked on it, the dust behaved differently than sand on Earth. It didn't scatter in clouds because there's no air to carry it. Instead, it followed clean, predictable arcs, falling back to the surface almost immediately. The mainstream explanation for this behavior is straightforward physics. Without air resistance, particles move in simple ballistic trajectories. And when you watch footage of astronauts kicking up dust, that's exactly what you see. But again, perception plays a role. To someone used to Earth environments, the lack of dispersion, the way the dust seems to fall so cleanly, can feel unusual, not incorrect, just unfamiliar. And this pattern keeps repeating. Details that are consistent with physics, but outside our everyday experience. Now, consider something even more subtle: the horizon. On Earth, our sense of distance is influenced by atmosphere. Light scatters. Distant objects fade slightly. The horizon feels soft, gradual. On the Moon, there is no atmosphere. The horizon appears sharp, close, almost abrupt. Objects in the distance don't fade in the same way. They remain crisp until they disappear behind the curvature of the surface. This creates a visual effect that can feel compressed. Distances are harder to judge. Things may appear closer or farther than they actually are. And when you combine that with wide-angle lenses used in cameras, the result can feel slightly distorted. Again, not wrong, but different. And that difference matters, because it shapes how we interpret what we see. Now, let's move to something that often gets less attention: radiation. Space is filled with radiation. Solar radiation, cosmic rays, particles that are largely filtered out by Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field. The Moon, lacking both, is more exposed. The mainstream explanation addresses this through timing and exposure. The Apollo missions were relatively short. The trajectories were chosen to minimize exposure to the most intense radiation belts. The spacecraft and suits provided some level of shielding, and the measured doses received by astronauts, according to official records, were within survivable limits. But this introduces another layer of complexity. Because radiation is not something we can see or feel directly. It's something we understand through measurement, through instruments, through data, and once again, we rely on systems of expertise to interpret that data, not because we have to blindly trust, but because the phenomena themselves are not directly observable in everyday terms. And so, we return to that recurring theme. The Moon landing exists at the intersection of direct experience and interpreted reality. Some aspects are visible: images, footage, physical samples. Others are inferred: radiation levels, internal system performance, precise environmental conditions. And both are necessary to form a complete picture. Now, let's shift slightly to time. Not just the duration of the mission, but the way time feels within it. The actual time spent on the lunar surface during the first landing was relatively short, just a few hours. And yet, within that time, a remarkable number of tasks were completed. Experiments were set up. Samples were collected, photographs were taken, observations were made. From the mainstream perspective, this efficiency was the result of meticulous planning. Every step was rehearsed, every action was timed. The astronauts followed a schedule designed to maximize productivity within a limited window. But when you think about it, it raises an interesting feeling. Not doubt, but intensity. Because every moment mattered. There was no room for extended exploration, no time to wander beyond the plan. Everything was focused, deliberate. And that focus shapes how the event unfolds in our minds. It wasn't a leisurely visit. It was a precise operation, a brief presence in an environment that allowed no margin for distraction. And then, it was over. The ascent module lifted off. The astronauts returned to orbit, and eventually, back to Earth, leaving behind footprints, equipment, and a surface that would remain unchanged for decades. Untouched, silent, and that silence might be one of the most fascinating parts of all. Because on the Moon, nothing erases those traces. No wind, no rain, no erosion in the way we understand it. The footprints left in 1969 are still there, unchanged, frozen in time. And when you think about that, it creates a strange contrast. A moment that felt so immediate, so alive, broadcast across the world, now exists as something almost permanent, yet distant, like a memory that never fades, but also never updates. So as we continue, we're going to keep exploring these layers, not to disrupt the story, but to understand it more deeply. Because the moon landing is not just about reaching another world. It's about how we perceive that world, how we interpret what we see, and how we connect those interpretations into something we call reality. And the more carefully we look, the more we begin to notice that even the most familiar stories still have quiet corners, places where the light doesn't fully reach, not because anything is hidden, but because we haven't looked closely enough yet. As we keep moving forward, slowly, almost like retracing steps across that silent surface, another layer begins to come into focus. Not the hardware, not the images, but the record of the mission itself. Because every major event in history leaves behind two things: what happened and what was documented about what happened. And those two things are not always identical. Not because of deception, but because documentation is always a process of translation. Reality becomes data. Data becomes recordings. Recordings become archives. And archives, over time, become history. The Apollo missions were among the most heavily documented events of their time. Audio recordings, telemetry data, photographs, engineering logs, transcripts, an enormous amount of information was generated, stored, and analyzed. The mainstream explanation emphasizes this abundance of data as a strength. The more information available, the more ways there are to verify, cross-check, and understand the event. Nothing exists in isolation. Each piece connects to others, forming a dense network of records. And in many ways, that's true. But when you look closely at how that data was handled, preserved, and in some cases, lost, it introduces a quieter, more subtle question. Not about whether the landing occurred, but about how clearly we can still see it. For example, the original telemetry data. This was the raw stream of information coming directly from the spacecraft. Measurements of position, speed, system performance, environmental conditions. It was incredibly detailed, far beyond what could be shown in a television broadcast. The mainstream understanding is that much of this data was recorded, studied, and used extensively during and after the missions. However, over time, some original data tapes were overwritten or lost due to storage limitations and practices of the era. At the time, this wasn't unusual. Magnetic tapes were expensive. Data storage was finite. Once information had been processed and summarized, the original recordings were not always preserved indefinitely. From a practical standpoint, it made sense. But from a modern perspective, it feels different. Because today, we're used to storing everything. Raw data is often kept, duplicated, backed up across multiple systems. The idea of losing original mission data from one of the most significant events in human history feels unexpected, not suspicious, but surprising. And that surprise creates a small gap, a space where curiosity naturally enters. What exactly was on those tapes? How much of it is preserved in other forms? How much detail has been condensed, summarized, or filtered through layers of interpretation? Again, the mainstream answers exist. Data was not entirely lost. Much of it survives in reports, analyses, and secondary recordings. The key information was retained, studied, and shared. But the original form of some of that data, the closest thing to a direct, unfiltered record, is no longer fully accessible. And that distinction matters, because there's something uniquely powerful about primary data, not because it changes the conclusions, but because it removes a layer of translation. It lets you see the event as it was recorded, not as it was later described. Now, let's consider the audio, the voices of the astronauts, the communication between spacecraft and mission control. These recordings are some of the most immediate connections we have to the event. And when you listen to them, there's a calmness, a controlled, almost understated tone, even during critical moments. The mainstream explanation is grounded in training. Astronauts were selected not just for technical skill, but for psychological stability. They were trained to remain composed, to communicate clearly, to manage stress without letting it affect their performance. And that makes sense. But when you listen closely, especially during moments where things were not entirely smooth, there's an interesting contrast, because the situation itself was extremely high risk. Unfamiliar terrain, limited fuel, systems operating at the edge of their capabilities. And yet, the voices remained steady, not emotionless, but controlled, measured. And that control, while understandable, can feel almost unusual when compared to how most people react under pressure. Not wrong, but noteworthy, because it highlights the difference between trained response and natural reaction. And again, this is not a contradiction, it's a detail, a piece of the larger pattern. Now, let's move to something even more abstract. Time delay, not just in communication, but in understanding. Because when the moon landing happened, people experienced it in real time, or something very close to it. But today, we experience it through history, through layers of retelling, reinterpretation, and technological change. The footage we see has been restored, enhanced, sometimes color-corrected. The audio has been cleaned up. The images have been digitized, sometimes sharpened, sometimes reprocessed. And while these efforts aim to bring us closer to the original experience, they also introduce a paradox. Because the more we refine the record, the further we move from its original form. A restored image is clearer, but not identical to what was first transmitted. A cleaned-up audio recording is easier to understand, but not exactly what was heard in 1969. And this creates a subtle tension between clarity and authenticity. Which version feels more real? The raw, imperfect original, or the refined, accessible version we have today? There's no simple answer, but the question itself is interesting, because it reminds us that history is not static. It evolves, not in what happened, but in how it is presented. Now, let's consider the transcripts. Every word spoken during the mission has been transcribed, analyzed, archived. You can read through entire conversations, line by line, following the progression of the mission in detail. And when you do, something becomes apparent. The language is precise, technical, focused. There's very little unnecessary dialogue. Every word serves a purpose. From the mainstream perspective, this reflects the nature of the mission. Communication bandwidth was limited. Clarity was essential. There was no room for ambiguity, but it also creates a certain atmosphere, a sense that everything is controlled, not just the systems, but the narrative itself. Again, not intentionally constructed, but shaped by necessity, because when communication is limited, it becomes efficient. And when it becomes efficient, it becomes structured. And when it becomes structured, it begins to feel almost scripted, not because it is, but because it lacks the randomness of everyday conversation. And that can influence how it's perceived. Now, step back for a moment. Look at all these layers together. Lost or overwritten data, processed recordings, restored images, structured communication. None of these on their own suggest anything unusual, but together, they create a picture that is not perfectly direct. It's mediated, filtered through time, technology, and human systems. And that's not unique to the moon landing. It's true of all history. But because the moon landing is such a singular event, such a distant one, those layers become more noticeable, more worth examining. So as we continue, we're not peeling back the story to find something hidden. We're simply recognizing that the story itself is made of layers. And the deeper you go, the more you begin to see not just what happened, but how we came to understand what happened. And sometimes, that second part is just as interesting as the first. As we continue, gently moving deeper into the structure of this story, it becomes clear that there's one layer we haven't fully explored yet, and it might be one of the most important. Not the technology, not the images, not even the records, but the people behind it all. Because when we talk about the moon landing, it's easy to think in terms of systems and outcomes. Rockets launching, modules landing, data being transmitted. But behind every one of those actions, there were individuals making decisions, solving problems, and interpreting information in real time. And that human element introduces something that no machine, no matter how advanced, can fully eliminate. Uncertainty. The mainstream understanding presents the Apollo program as a carefully coordinated effort involving thousands of experts, engineers, mathematicians, technicians, flight controllers, and astronauts. Each person had a specific role. Each system had layers of redundancy, and together they formed a structure designed to minimize risk as much as possible. But no system built by humans is ever completely free of ambiguity, because at every stage, decisions had to be made. Not all of them based on complete information. Not all of them perfectly predictable. For example, consider mission control. A room filled with specialists, each monitoring a different aspect of the mission. Guidance, propulsion, life support, communication. Data streamed in constantly. Numbers, signals, status indicators, all needing to be interpreted quickly and accurately. The mainstream explanation emphasizes how well this worked. Flight controllers were highly trained, disciplined, and supported by procedures designed to guide decision-making under pressure. And yet, if you slow that moment down, it becomes something almost astonishing. Because those decisions were not made in hindsight. They were made in real time, with incomplete data, with the awareness that a wrong call could have irreversible consequences. And still, the mission continued. Now, let's consider the astronauts again, not just as trained professionals, but as individuals operating in an environment no human had ever experienced before. Even with simulations, even with preparation, there is always a difference between training and reality, especially when that reality involves stepping onto another world. The mainstream perspective often highlights their composure, the calm voices, the measured actions, the focus on tasks. And that composure is real. It was part of what made the mission possible. But beneath that, there must have been something else. Not panic, not fear in the dramatic sense, but awareness. An understanding of the situation that goes beyond technical details. Because imagine it for a moment, not as a distant event, but as an experience. You are standing on a surface that has never known life. Above you, Earth hangs in the sky, small and distant. There is no air, no sound, no movement except your own. Every system you rely on is contained within the suit you're wearing. Every breath is managed, every step is deliberate. And beyond that small area, there is nothing, just space. From the mainstream explanation, this is framed as exploration, an extension of human presence into new environments. But if you sit with it quietly, it also becomes something more introspective. A moment where the boundary between human experience and the unknown becomes very thin. And that matters. Because even in the most controlled technical missions, human perception still plays a role. What you notice, what you prioritize, how you interpret what you see. Now, let's shift to something slightly different. Not what was done, but what was chosen. Because every mission involves selection. Which experiments to conduct, which areas to explore, which data to prioritize. Time on the lunar surface was limited. Every minute had to be used carefully. This meant that choices were made in advance, plans created, schedules defined, objectives set. The mainstream explanation presents this as efficiency. With limited time and resources, focusing on specific goals ensured that the mission would produce meaningful results. But selection always involves exclusion. For every task that was completed, there were others that were not. For every area explored, there were areas left untouched. And that introduces an interesting perspective, because what we know about the moon is shaped not just by what was observed, but by what was chosen to be observed. And those choices were influenced by the knowledge and priorities of the time. Geological samples were prioritized. Certain regions were selected based on what scientists believed would be most informative. And that makes sense. But it also means that our understanding of the moon is, in some ways, directional, guided by decisions made decades ago. Now, consider this. If the same missions were planned today, with modern technology, modern knowledge, would the choices be the same? Would the landing sites be identical? Would the experiments follow the same structure? Or would new questions lead to different priorities? This doesn't change what happened, but it highlights that knowledge is always evolving, and that what we know is shaped by the context in which we seek to know it. Now, let's return briefly to the broader team. Thousands of people contributed to the Apollo program, but only a few became the visible faces of it. The astronauts, mission control, public figures. The rest remained largely behind the scenes. Engineers working on specific components, technicians assembling systems, analysts reviewing data, each person contributing a small part to a much larger whole. The mainstream explanation celebrates this as a collective achievement, and it is. But it also introduces another subtle layer. Because in large systems, no single person sees everything. Knowledge is distributed, fragmented. Each individual understands their piece, but not necessarily the entire system. And that's not a flaw. It's how complex systems function. But it does mean that the full picture exists only in the integration of those parts, not in any one perspective. And that makes the story inherently layered. Because to understand it completely, you have to trust not just one source, but the alignment of many. And when those sources align, we call it confirmation. But when we examine them individually, we begin to see how each piece contributes to the whole. So as we continue, keep that in mind. The moon landing is not just a technical achievement, it's a human one, built on decisions, interpretations, and cooperation at a scale that is difficult to fully grasp. And when you look at it that way, it becomes less like a single solid event, and more like a tapestry, woven from thousands of threads, each one real, each one necessary, but only forming the full picture when viewed together. And maybe, just maybe, the most interesting questions are not about any single thread, but about how they all connect. As we continue, letting all of these layers settle into something more complete, there's another dimension that quietly begins to emerge. Not something technical, not something visual, but something almost psychological. Because the moon landing didn't just happen in the physical world, it happened in the human mind. And that may sound abstract at first, but if you follow it carefully, it leads somewhere very real. In 1969, the idea of reaching the moon was still, for many people, something that belonged more to imagination than reality. It had lived for decades in science fiction, in stories, in speculation about the future. The moon was close enough to see, but distant enough to feel unreachable. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. The mainstream explanation frames this as a natural progression of technological advancement, step by step, from early rocketry to orbital flight to lunar missions, each stage building on the last. But from a psychological perspective, it was a leap, not just in distance, but in perception. Because overnight, something that felt impossible became something that had already been done. And that shift is not always easy to fully process, even today, because when something crosses that boundary, from imagined to real, it often carries with it a kind of lingering disbelief. Not in the sense of rejection, but in the sense of scale. Did that really happen? Not as a challenge, but as a reflection of how extraordinary it is. And this is where the conversation around the moon landing often becomes more complex. Because it's not just about evidence, it's about how people relate to that evidence. Some people look at the data, the records, the samples, and see a clear, consistent picture. Others look at the same information and feel a kind of distance from it. Not because it's incorrect, but because it feels almost too far removed from everyday experience. And when something feels distant, the mind naturally tries to bridge that gap. Sometimes with questions, sometimes with alternative interpretations, not always as a rejection of reality, but as an attempt to make sense of it. Now, let's consider how the moon landing has been presented over time. In the years immediately following the missions, it was a dominant topic. It was current, immediate, something people had just witnessed. But as time passed, it became history. And history has a different quality. It becomes condensed, simplified, turned into key moments, key images, key phrases. The complexity remains, but it moves into the background. And what stays in the foreground is the narrative. A few iconic visuals, a few lines of dialogue, a general understanding of what happened. And for most people, that's enough. But for some, that simplification creates curiosity. Because when something is reduced to a few key elements, it can feel incomplete. Like a story that has been summarized rather than fully told. And that's where deeper exploration begins. Not because the summary is wrong, but because it's only part of the picture. Now, let's look at something even more subtle. Repetition. Over the decades, the moon landing has been shown, discussed, and referenced countless times. The same images, the same clips, the same moments. And repetition does something interesting to perception. On one hand, it reinforces familiarity. The more you see something, the more real it feels. But on the other hand, it can also create a kind of detachment, because when something is repeated enough, it starts to feel almost symbolic, less like an event and more like an idea. And when that happens, people sometimes begin to question not the event itself, but their connection to it. Am I seeing this as it really was, or as it's been presented to me? Again, not a contradiction, just a shift in perspective. Now, consider generational distance. For those who were alive in 1969, the moon landing was a lived experience. They remember where they were, who they were with, how it felt to watch it unfold. For later generations, it's different. It's something learned, not remembered. And that changes how it's perceived. Because there's a difference between witnessing something and being told about it. Even when the information is accurate, the emotional connection is not the same. And that can influence how questions are formed. Not because one perspective is more valid than the other, but because they are shaped by different experiences. Now, let's bring all of this together. The moon landing exists at the intersection of physical reality and human perception. It is an event that happened, but also an event that has been interpreted, recorded, repeated, and reinterpreted over time. And those layers of interpretation don't change the event itself, but they do shape how we understand it. So when people ask questions about the moon landing, those questions are not always about the same thing. Sometimes they're about the technical details, sometimes they're about the records, and sometimes they're about the feeling, the sense of distance, the gap between what is known and what is personally experienced. And that gap is where curiosity lives. Not necessarily skepticism, not necessarily belief, just curiosity. A quiet desire to look a little closer, to understand a little more deeply, to move beyond the surface, without jumping to conclusions. And maybe that's what makes this topic so enduring. Not because it's unresolved, but because it continues to invite attention. Decades later, still. So as we continue, we'll keep following that curiosity, not pushing it in any direction, just letting it guide us. Because sometimes, the most interesting discoveries don't come from answers. They come from the questions that stay with you, the ones that don't demand resolution, only reflection. As we move further into this, there's one more layer that begins to take shape, and it sits quietly beneath everything we've explored so far. Not in the rockets, not in the footage, not even in the records or the people, but in something more subtle, patterns. Because when you step back from the moon landing, not as a single event, but as part of a broader timeline, it begins to align with something we see again and again throughout history. Moments of sudden acceleration, followed by stillness. And at first glance, the moon landing fits that pattern almost perfectly. In the span of just over a decade, humanity went from its first tentative steps into space to landing on another celestial body. The pace was extraordinary. Rapid advancements in propulsion, navigation, materials, computing, fields that had barely existed in practical terms, were suddenly being pushed to their limits. The mainstream explanation is grounded in context. The Cold War created urgency. Competition drove funding. National pride and strategic advantage aligned to produce an environment where resources, talent, and focus were concentrated in a way that is rarely sustained over long periods. And that explains the acceleration. But what about what came after? Because once the goal was achieved, that pace didn't continue. It didn't gradually taper off. It dropped, not to zero, but to something much quieter. No more human journeys beyond low Earth orbit. No return to the moon for decades. Instead, a shift towards space stations, robotic missions, satellites. Important, valuable, but fundamentally different. From the mainstream perspective, this is a natural transition. The initial goal had been met. The cost of continuing lunar missions was high. Public interest had shifted. New priorities emerged. And all of that makes sense. But if you look at the pattern itself, without immediately assigning reasons, it feels almost like a spike. A sudden rise, and then a long plateau. And that pattern invites a question. Not about the validity of the achievement, but about its place in the larger flow of progress. Because usually, technological advancement feels more continuous, gradual, building over time, but here, it feels concentrated, almost like a window that opened and then closed. Now, let's explore that idea carefully, not as a conclusion, but as a perspective. What creates windows like that? Moments where conditions align in a way that allows for rapid progress. History offers a few examples, periods where urgency, resources, and focus converge, often driven by external pressures. War, competition, existential challenges, these can accelerate development in ways that are difficult to replicate in more stable times. The moon landing fits that description. It was not just a scientific endeavor, it was a response to a specific moment in history. And when that moment passed, the conditions that made it possible began to shift. But here's where it gets interesting. Because even if the conditions changed, the knowledge didn't disappear. The understanding of how to reach the moon, how to land, how to return, that remained. And yet, it wasn't immediately used again. Not in the same way. And that creates a subtle tension. Because if something is possible, and known to be possible, why does it sometimes remain unused? Again, there are practical answers. Cost, risk, changing priorities, all valid. But the question itself is still worth sitting with, because it touches on something deeper than the moon landing. It touches on how humanity chooses what to pursue. Now, let's look at this from another angle. Not technological, but symbolic. Because the moon landing was not just an achievement, it was a statement. A demonstration of capability at the highest level. A moment that said, in a very clear way, this can be done. And once that statement was made, did it need to be repeated? From one perspective, perhaps not. The goal was never to establish a permanent presence on the moon at that time. It was to reach it, to prove it was possible. And once that proof existed, the objective had been fulfilled. But from another perspective, that feels incomplete. Because reaching a place is one thing. Returning to it, building on that presence, is something else entirely. And when that second phase doesn't immediately follow, it creates a sense of pause. Not necessarily a contradiction, but a break in momentum. Now, let's connect this back to perception. Because patterns don't just exist in events. They exist in how we interpret those events. When people look at the moon landing and see that spike, that sudden rise and plateau, they may interpret it in different ways. Some see it as a natural consequence of historical context. Others see it as something that invites further questioning. Not because the event itself is unclear, but because its trajectory feels unusual. And that difference in interpretation is important, because it shows that the same pattern can lead to different lines of thought. Now, let's bring in something even more subtle. Silence. Not the physical silence of the moon, but the conceptual silence that follows the event. After the final Apollo mission, the moon became quiet again. No human footsteps. No new images from the surface. Just orbiting spacecraft, distant observations, and the knowledge of what had already been done. And over time, that silence becomes part of the story. Not just what happened, but what didn't happen afterward. And that absence can feel just as significant as the presence. Not because it suggests anything hidden, but because it leaves space. Space for interpretation. Space for curiosity. Space for questions that don't have immediate answers. Because they're not about facts, but about patterns. So as we continue, keep that in mind. We're not just looking at events. We're looking at how those events fit into a larger picture. A picture that includes not just what was done, but when it was done, how quickly, and what followed. Because sometimes, the most revealing part of a story is not the moment itself, but the shape it leaves behind. As we continue, letting that idea of patterns gently settle into the background, another layer begins to reveal itself, one that is quieter, but perhaps even more intriguing. Replication. Because in science and engineering, replication is everything. It's not enough to achieve something once. True understanding is demonstrated when something can be done again and again, under varying conditions, with consistent results. That's how knowledge becomes reliable, how it moves from possibility into certainty. And this is where the moon landing takes on an interesting shape. The mainstream explanation reminds us that it was replicated. Multiple Apollo missions successfully reached the moon, landed, and returned. Apollo 11 was not a singular event in isolation. It was followed by several missions that expanded on the initial achievement, exploring different areas, conducting more complex experiments, and extending the time spent on the lunar surface. From that perspective, replication was clearly established. But when we widen the lens just a little, something subtle appears. Because those replications were all contained within a relatively short period of time, using the same overarching system, the same technological framework, the same historical context. After that, the replication stopped, not because it became impossible, but because it was no longer pursued in the same way. And that creates an interesting distinction between demonstrated capability and sustained capability. The moon landing clearly demonstrated that reaching the lunar surface and returning was achievable, but sustaining that capability, keeping it active, evolving it, integrating it into ongoing exploration, that did not continue, at least not immediately. And that difference is worth paying attention to, because in most areas of technology, once something is proven, it tends to become more accessible over time. Computers become smaller and more powerful. Aircraft become more efficient. Communication becomes faster and more widespread. Progress builds on itself, but with the moon landing, the trajectory feels different, not reversed, but paused. And that pause invites a question, not about whether the achievement was real, but about why it wasn't extended. Now, the mainstream explanations are grounded and practical. The cost of Apollo was enormous. It required a level of funding and coordination that was difficult to maintain. Public interest began to shift after the initial landings. The geopolitical urgency that had driven the program began to ease. And so, priorities changed. Focus moved towards space stations, robotic exploration, and eventually, long-term orbital presence. All of this fits within a logical framework, but when you sit with it, there's still something quietly unusual about it. Because going to the moon is not just another technological milestone. It's a threshold, a boundary crossed. And once crossed, you might expect it to become part of an ongoing path. Not necessarily constant, but recurring. And yet, it didn't. Not for decades. Now, let's explore another angle of replication, not physical, but informational. Because if something can be done, it can be described, documented, taught, reconstructed. The knowledge required to reach the moon didn't vanish. It exists in engineering documents, mission reports, training materials, and the collective understanding of those who worked on the program. But knowledge on its own is not always enough, because complex systems are not just built from information, they are built from context. The exact materials available at the time, the specific manufacturing processes, the teams of people who understood how to assemble and operate those systems, the infrastructure that supported it all. And when that context changes, replication becomes more difficult. Not impossible, but not immediate. It's like having the blueprint for something incredibly intricate, but not the exact tools or environment that originally brought it to life. You can rebuild it, but it requires effort, coordination, and sometimes rediscovery. And that's part of what we're seeing today. Renewed interest in returning to the moon, new programs being developed, new technologies being designed. In a way, not just continuing the path, but reconnecting with it. Now, let's shift slightly to perception again. Because replication also affects how something is felt. When something happens once, it can feel extraordinary. When it happens repeatedly, it becomes familiar. And familiarity changes perception. If humans had continued to land on the moon regularly over the past decades, the event itself might feel less mysterious today, more integrated into our understanding of what's possible. But because it didn't, because it exists as a cluster of events in the past, it retains a certain distance, a sense of being both real and slightly out of reach. And that distance creates space for reflection. Not doubt, not certainty, but something in between. Now, let's bring this back to the bigger picture. The moon landing sits at a unique point in history. It was achieved, it was repeated, and then it stopped. Not permanently, but long enough to create a noticeable gap. And that gap is part of the story. Not because it changes what happened, but because it shapes how we think about what happened. Because when something is both proven and not continuously present, it becomes something else, something that feels almost like a memory of capability, rather than a current expression of it. And that's where things become interesting. Because memory, even when accurate, has a different quality than direct experience. It's one step removed, one layer deeper. And as we continue, we'll keep exploring that space, not trying to resolve it, just understanding it. Because sometimes, the most meaningful insights don't come from what is immediately visible, but from what exists just beyond it, quietly, waiting to be noticed. As we move further into this, allowing all of these threads, technology, perception, patterns, replication, to slowly weave together, there is one more layer that begins to emerge, almost quietly beneath everything else. Scale. Because the moon landing is not just a technical achievement, it is an event that operates on a scale that is difficult to fully grasp, not just in distance, but in coordination. Thousands of individuals, millions of components, countless calculations, decisions, and interactions, all needing to align with extraordinary precision. And when something operates at that scale, it introduces a unique kind of complexity. The mainstream understanding embraces this complexity as part of the achievement. The Apollo program is often described as one of the most intricate engineering efforts ever undertaken. Systems were designed to interact seamlessly, redundancies were built in, failures were anticipated and accounted for, and somehow it worked. But when you pause on that idea and really let it settle, it raises a subtle question, not about whether it worked, but about what it means for something that complex to work at all. Because complexity has a tendency to behave in unexpected ways. The more interconnected a system becomes, the more potential there is for small variations to produce larger effects. A minor miscalculation, a slight delay, a component behaving just outside its expected parameters. Any of these in isolation might seem insignificant, but within a tightly coupled system, they can cascade. And yet, during the moon landing, they didn't, or at least, not in a way that prevented success. From the mainstream perspective, this is the result of careful design, rigorous testing, and the extraordinary skill of everyone involved. And that's true, but it also highlights something else, because success at that level of complexity is not just about eliminating risk, it's about managing it, accepting that not everything can be predicted, and building systems that can adapt when the unexpected occurs. And we saw glimpses of that. Alarms during descent, adjustments to landing trajectories, moments where decisions had to be made quickly, based on incomplete information. And each time, the system held, not perfectly, but well enough. Now, let's take a step back Because when we talk about scale, we're not just talking about the mission itself. We're talking about how that mission fits into the broader scale of human capability. The moon is not just far. It is, in many ways, the first step beyond our immediate environment. Low Earth orbit is still close. Relatively speaking, the moon is something else. Reaching it requires leaving behind the safety net of Earth's immediate gravitational influence, navigating a space where margins for error become even smaller. And returning adds another layer entirely. It's not just about getting there, it's about coming back, safely, reliably. And when you consider that, the scale of the achievement becomes even more pronounced. Because it's not a one-way journey, it's a complete cycle. Now, let's connect this to something more subtle: visibility. Because events at that scale are often only partially visible. We see the launch, we see the landing, we hear the voices, we see the images. But most of what happens out of sight, inside systems, within calculations, in processes that are not directly observable. And that creates a kind of imbalance between what we can see and what we have to understand indirectly. The mainstream explanation bridges that gap with data, with reports, with analysis. But for someone looking at the event from the outside, that gap remains, not as a flaw, but as a feature of how complex systems operate. Now, consider this. If you were to reconstruct the moon landing entirely from what is directly visible, images, footage, audio, you would have a compelling story, but you would not have the full picture, because the full picture exists in layers that are not immediately accessible. And that's where expertise comes in. Scientists, engineers, historians, each interpreting different parts of the system, contributing to a collective understanding. But again, that understanding is distributed. No single perspective contains everything, and that's important, because it means that the moon landing is not just a fixed object of knowledge, it's a network of interpretations, aligned, consistent, but still composed of many parts. Now, let's shift slightly, from scale to fragility. Because something operating at that level of complexity is also, in a sense, delicate. Not fragile in the sense of being weak, but in the sense of requiring precise conditions. Everything has to be just right. Timing, alignment, function. And when those conditions are met, the system works. But if they are not, the outcome changes. And that adds another layer to how we understand the event. Because it wasn't just about capability, it was about timing, the right moment, the right conditions, the right convergence of factors. And that brings us back, once again, to that idea of a window, a period where everything aligned, where the resources, the knowledge, the motivation, and the opportunity all came together. And when that window passed, the alignment shifted, not disappeared, but changed. And so the event remains, not as something that couldn't be repeated, but as something that hasn't yet been repeated in quite the same way. Now, take a moment and let all of that settle. The scale, the complexity, the coordination, the fragility, the visibility, and the parts that remain just out of sight. Because when you bring all of these together, the moon landing becomes something more than a single achievement. It becomes a reflection of what happens when human capability reaches a certain threshold and crosses it, briefly, clearly, and then pauses, not ending, not reversing, just pausing. And in that pause, there is space. Space to look back, space to analyze, space to ask questions that are not about proving or disproving, but about understanding. Understanding how something like this happens, what makes it possible, and what it means that it happened when it did. So as we continue, We'll keep exploring that space, not rushing, not forcing conclusions, just observing, carefully. Because sometimes, the most complex stories are the ones that appear simplest on the surface. As we continue, gently holding all of these layers in place, another dimension begins to surface, one that sits quietly between what we can measure and what we can't. Uncertainty, not in the sense of doubt, but in the sense of limits. Because no matter how detailed a system is, no matter how much data is collected, there are always edges beyond which certainty fades. And the moon landing, for all its precision, exists within those edges. The mainstream understanding presents the mission as one of the most carefully calculated endeavors ever attempted. Orbital mechanics were mapped with extraordinary accuracy. Trajectories were planned down to fine margins. Systems were tested repeatedly, refined, adjusted. And yet, even within that level of control, there were unknowns, not complete unknowns, but areas where prediction had limits. For example, the lunar surface itself. Before the first landing, there were questions about what it would be like. Would the regolith support the weight of a landing module? Would it behave in predictable ways? Would there be hidden hazards that couldn't be seen from orbit? These questions were studied, modeled, estimated. But until a human actually landed, they weren't fully resolved. And that's an important point, because it shows that the mission wasn't just an execution of known procedures. It was also an encounter with the partially unknown. And that encounter introduces uncertainty, not as a flaw, but as a condition of exploration. Now, consider navigation. Traveling to the moon is not like traveling across a fixed surface. It involves moving through space, where position is determined relative to constantly changing reference points. Small errors can compound over time. Tiny variations in velocity or direction can lead to significant differences in outcome. The mainstream explanation highlights how these challenges were managed through guidance systems, mid-course corrections, and constant monitoring. And they were. But management is not elimination, it's adaptation, working within uncertainty rather than removing it entirely. And that distinction matters, because it reminds us that even the most precise missions operate within margins that are understood, but not always perfectly controlled. Now, let's shift to something more subtle: prediction. Because much of the moon landing relied not just on reacting to conditions, but on anticipating them, calculating what would happen before it happened. And prediction, by its nature, involves uncertainty, not because it's unreliable, but because it deals with possibilities rather than certainties. The calculations can be incredibly accurate, but they are still projections. And when those projections align with reality, we call it success. But when they don't, adjustments are required. And during the moon landing, there were moments where adjustments were made. Small ones, precise ones, but still, deviations from the original plan. And that's not unusual. In fact, it's expected. But it reinforces the idea that the mission was not a rigid sequence of events. It was dynamic, responsive, adapting in real time to conditions as they unfolded. Now, let's bring this into a broader perspective. Because uncertainty doesn't just exist within the mission itself, it exists in how we understand it afterward. No matter how much data we have, no matter how many recordings, reports, or analyses exist, our understanding is always, to some degree, interpretive. We piece together information, we connect details, we form a coherent picture, and that picture can be highly accurate, but it is still a representation, not the event itself. And that's a subtle but important distinction, because it means that there is always a small space between what happened and how we describe what happened, a space where interpretation lives. Now, for most events, that space is small enough to feel negligible. But for something as complex, as distant, and as layered as the moon landing, it becomes more noticeable. Not because the event is unclear, but because the scale of interpretation is larger. More data, more perspectives, more ways of connecting the pieces. And that naturally leads to different emphases, different ways of framing the same underlying reality. Now, let's consider something even more abstract. Confidence. Not certainty, but confidence. Because in science and engineering, absolute certainty is rare. What we have instead is confidence based on evidence. The more evidence aligns, the higher the confidence. The moon landing, from the mainstream perspective, is supported by a vast amount of aligned evidence, technical data, physical samples, independent observations, consistent records, and that alignment creates a very high level of confidence. But confidence is not the same as direct experience. For most people, it is something accepted rather than personally verified. And that's where uncertainty, in its quietest form, remains. Not as a challenge, but as a boundary. The point where knowledge transitions from direct to indirect. And that boundary is not unique to the moon landing. It exists in much of what we know. But because the moon landing is so far removed from everyday experience, that boundary feels more pronounced. Now, let's pause here for a moment. Because what we're seeing is not a weakening of the story, but a deepening of it. The presence of uncertainty does not diminish the achievement. It contextualizes it. It reminds us that exploration is not about eliminating the unknown, but about moving through it, carefully, deliberately, and sometimes successfully. So as we continue, keep that in mind. We're not looking for perfect clarity, we're looking for understanding. An understanding that includes not just what is known, but where the edges of that knowledge begin to soften, because those edges are where curiosity lives. And curiosity is what keeps the story alive, even decades later, even now. As we continue, moving gently along these edges where knowledge and interpretation begin to blur, another layer begins to emerge, one that sits quietly beneath everything we've explored so far. Memory. Not just individual memory, but collective memory. Because the moon landing is not only an event that happened, it is an event that has been remembered. And memory, even at its most accurate, is not the same as direct experience. The mainstream understanding preserves the moon landing through records, archives, footage, and data. These form the backbone of how the event is remembered, stable, consistent, and widely accessible. They act as anchors, preventing the story from drifting too far from what actually occurred. But memory itself operates differently. It simplifies. It selects. It emphasizes certain moments while allowing others to fade into the background. And over time, this process shapes not just what we remember, but how we remember it. For many people, the moon landing exists as a series of key images and ideas. A footprint in dust, a flag standing still in a place without wind, a voice speaking calmly across an impossible distance. These elements become symbolic. They represent the event, but they are not the entirety of it. And when something becomes symbolic, it begins to take on a different quality, less like a detailed record, and more like a shared understanding. Now, that shared understanding is not inaccurate, but it is condensed. It carries the essence of the event, without all of its complexity. And for most purposes, that's enough. But when you begin to look closer, When you move beyond the symbols and into the details, the difference becomes noticeable. Because the real event was not just those moments. It was everything around them. The preparation, the uncertainty, the decisions that didn't make it into the highlights, the small details that rarely get repeated. And that's where memory and history begin to diverge slightly. Not in truth, but in resolution. Memory tends to operate at a lower resolution. Broad shapes, clear outlines, essential features. History, when examined closely, exists at a much higher resolution. Dense, layered, full of nuance. And the moon landing exists in both forms at once. Now, let's consider how memory evolves over time. Because collective memory is not static. It changes. Not because the event changes, but because the context around it changes. New generations encounter it differently. New technologies present it in new ways. New questions arise, not because something is wrong, but because perspective shifts. For example, the footage of the moon landing. For those who watched it live, it was immediate, almost surreal in its immediacy. For those who watch it today, it's historical, processed, removed from the moment in which it occurred. And that changes how it feels. Not what it is, but how it is experienced. Now, let's take this one step further. Because memory doesn't just preserve events, it also interacts with expectation. What we expect something to be like influences how we interpret it, and the moon landing exists in a unique position here, because it is both familiar and unfamiliar. Familiar, because we've seen it so many times. Unfamiliar, because it represents an environment and an experience far removed from everyday life. And that combination can create an interesting effect, a kind of cognitive distance, where something is well known, but not deeply understood on a sensory level. And in that distance, questions can emerge, not necessarily about the facts, but about the connection. How does this fit into my understanding of reality? And that question is subtle. It's not about proving or disproving. It's about integration. Now, let's bring this back to the present. Because today, the moon landing exists alongside a vast amount of information. More data than ever before. More access. More ways to explore the details. And yet, at the same time, it remains something that most people encounter at a surface level. Through summaries, through highlights, through repeated imagery. And that creates a kind of dual existence. The detailed version, available to those who seek it, and the simplified version, experienced by most. Neither is wrong, but they are different, and the gap between them is where curiosity often begins. Now, pause for a moment and consider how this feels, not as an abstract idea, but as something personal. The moon landing is something you know about, something you've seen, something that exists in your awareness. But how much of it feels direct? How much of it feels like something you've truly experienced versus something you've been shown? And that question doesn't diminish the event. It highlights the nature of knowledge itself. Because most of what we know through layers, through memory, through records, through interpretation, and the moon landing is no exception. But because of its scale, its uniqueness, those layers become more visible, more noticeable, more worth exploring. So as we continue, we'll keep following that thread, not trying to resolve memory into certainty, but understanding how memory shapes what we think we know. Because sometimes, the difference between knowing something and understanding it is simply a matter of looking a little closer, not at the event itself, but at how it lives within us. As we continue, letting all of these layers, uncertainty, memory, perception, settle into something quieter, something more reflective, another dimension begins to take shape. Perspective. Because the moon landing, like many significant events, changes depending on where you stand when you look at it. From one perspective, it is a clear, documented achievement, a culmination of engineering, science, and human determination. The evidence aligns, the records are consistent, the conclusions are widely accepted. From another perspective, it is something more distant, not unclear, but not fully tangible either. An event that exists through layers of mediation, interpretation, and time. And both of these perspectives can exist at the same time, not in conflict, but in parallel. The mainstream understanding emphasizes clarity: what was done, how it was done, why it was done. It provides structure, explanation, and confidence. And for many, that is enough. But perspective is shaped not just by information, but by position, where you are in relation to the event, not physically, but cognitively. How much you've explored it, how closely you've examined the details, what questions you've allowed yourself to ask, and what you've chosen not to ask. Now, let's consider something simple: distance. The moon is, on average, about 384,000 kilometers away from Earth. A number that is easy to say, but difficult to feel. Because distance at that scale doesn't translate easily into human experience. We can understand it intellectually, but emotionally, it remains abstract. And that abstraction influences perspective. Because something that far away, something that cannot be visited, touched, or experienced directly by most people, naturally feels different from something that can, even if the evidence is equally strong. Now, combine that physical distance with time. More than half a century has passed since the first moon landing. And time adds another layer. Because as time increases, direct connection decreases. The event moves further into history, further into memory, further into interpretation. And perspective shifts accordingly. Now, let's bring in another element: familiarity. We've all seen images of the moon landing, heard the recordings, read about the missions, and familiarity creates a sense of knowing. But familiarity is not the same as understanding. It's possible to be very familiar with something and still have unanswered questions about how it all fits together. And that's where perspective becomes fluid. Because as you look closer, as you move from familiarity into deeper examination, your perspective begins to change, not necessarily toward doubt, but toward complexity. You start to see more layers, more connections, more details that weren't immediately obvious. And that shift can feel like stepping into a different version of the same story, not a different event, but a different level of resolution. Now, let's consider something even more subtle: expectation. Because how we expect something to look or feel plays a role in how we interpret it. The moon landing exists in a space where expectation and reality don't always perfectly align. We expect space to feel a certain way, to look a certain way, to behave according to our intuitive understanding. But space doesn't follow those expectations. Light behaves differently. Motion behaves differently. Sound is absent. And when those differences appear in images or footage, they can feel unfamiliar, not incorrect, but unexpected. And that unexpected quality can influence perspective. It can make something real feel almost unreal, simply because it doesn't match our internal model of how things should be. Now, let's step back, because what we're seeing is not a contradiction, it's a layering of perspectives, each one shaped by different factors: distance, time, familiarity, expectation. And the moon landing exists at the intersection of all of them. which means that how it is perceived is not fixed. It evolves, not because the event changes, but because the lens through which we view it changes. Now, here's where it becomes interesting. Because when multiple perspectives exist, there is a tendency to look for a single, definitive viewpoint, a way to resolve everything into one clear interpretation. But sometimes, that's not how understanding works. Sometimes, multiple perspectives can coexist, each highlighting different aspects of the same reality. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that understanding is not about choosing one perspective over another, but about seeing how they all fit together. Now, pause for a moment and consider where you are in relation to this story. Not geographically, but perceptually. Are you looking at it from a distance, taking in the broad shape of the event? Or are you closer, examining the details, noticing the small variations, the subtle complexities? And how does that position shape what you see? Because perspective doesn't just influence interpretation, it defines it. And the moon landing, more than most events, invites that awareness. It encourages you to shift your viewpoint, to look at it from different angles, not to find contradictions, but to deepen understanding. So as we move toward the final parts of this exploration, keep that in mind. We're not moving toward a single answer. We're moving toward a clearer view, a view that includes not just the event itself, but the many ways it can be seen. Because sometimes, clarity doesn't come from narrowing your focus. It comes from widening it, just enough to see the full shape of what's there. As we move closer to the end of this journey, allowing everything we've explored to settle into a kind of quiet clarity, one final layer begins to emerge: integration. Because up until now, we've been looking at the moon landing from different angles: technology, perception, records, memory, uncertainty, patterns, perspective. Each layer revealing something slightly different, each one adding depth to the overall picture. But understanding doesn't come from looking at these layers separately. It comes from seeing how they fit together. And when you begin to do that, something interesting happens. The moon landing stops feeling like a single question and starts feeling like a system of understanding. The mainstream explanation, when viewed in isolation, is strong. It is supported by engineering data, physical samples, consistent records, and alignment across multiple independent sources. It presents a coherent narrative that explains not just what happened, but how it happened. And when all of those elements are viewed together, they reinforce each other. But the other layers we've explored, perception, memory, distance, unfamiliar environments, don't contradict that structure. They exist alongside it. They explain why, even with strong evidence, the event can still feel distant. Why something so well documented can still feel slightly out of reach. Why familiarity does not always translate into intuitive understanding. And when you integrate those two sides, the clarity becomes deeper, not weaker. Because the moon landing is not just an engineering achievement, it is also a human experience, filtered through time. Now, let's take a moment to bring everything together. The technology was real, complex, precise, operating at the limits of what was possible at the time. The environment was real, unfamiliar, extreme, behaving in ways that challenge our intuition. The records are real, extensive, layered, though sometimes filtered through the limitations of how they were preserved. The people were real, making decisions, interpreting data, adapting in real time. The patterns are real, a sudden acceleration of capability, followed by a long pause. And the perception is real, the sense of distance, the questions that arise not from contradiction, but from unfamiliarity. None of these cancel each other out. They form a complete picture, a picture that is both grounded and complex. And maybe that's where the true nature of this story lies, not in whether it happened, but in how we relate to the fact that it did. Because for most of human history, the moon was something we could only observe, a distant presence in the sky, constant, unreachable. And then, for a brief period, that changed. Humans went there, stood there, left marks that are still there today, and then returned. And since then, we've been in a kind of in-between state, knowing it's possible, but not actively experiencing it. And that creates a unique kind of tension, not uncertainty about the event itself, but a sense of distance from it, like standing at the edge of something that was once crossed, but hasn't been crossed again in quite the same way. Now, let's sit with that for a moment. Because this isn't about resolving every question. It's about understanding why the questions exist. Why something so well established can still feel so intriguing. Why it continues to invite exploration decades later. And the answer may be simpler than it seems. Because the moon landing sits at the intersection of two things that don't always align easily: certainty and imagination. We have strong evidence, clear records, consistent explanations, and at the same time, we are dealing with something that lies far outside everyday experience, a place we don't visit, an environment we don't feel, a journey we don't personally take. And when those two things meet, certainty in the abstract and distance in experience, the result is not doubt, it's curiosity. A quiet, persistent curiosity that doesn't demand contradiction, only understanding. And that curiosity is not a problem to be solved. It's a signal that there is more to explore, more to think about, more to understand, not just about the event, but about how we process events like this. So as we come to the final part, we're not going to close the story. We're going to step back and look at what remains, not as unanswered questions, but as open spaces, spaces where thinking continues, where curiosity stays active, where the story, even now, is still unfolding in the way we understand it. Because sometimes, the most complete understanding is the one that leaves just enough room for you to keep thinking about it, long after the story ends. As we arrive here, at the quiet edge of everything we've explored, it becomes clear that this was never really about reaching a final answer. It was about learning how to look, because the moon landing, when viewed from a distance, feels like a finished story, a moment defined, recorded, and placed neatly into history, something that happened and is now complete. But when you slow it down, when you move through it layer by layer, it becomes something else entirely. Not unfinished, but open. Open in the sense that understanding it is not a single step, but a process that unfolds depending on how closely you choose to look. We began with the familiar version of the story, the one most people know. A mission carried out with precision, supported by vast amounts of evidence, recognized globally as one of humanity's greatest achievements. And that foundation remains strong. But as we moved deeper, we noticed things that don't always appear in the simplified version. The complexity of the systems, the unfamiliar nature of the environment, the way images can feel unusual even when they are accurate. The layers of documentation, some preserved perfectly, others filtered through time. The human decisions made in real time, under conditions that cannot be fully replicated. The patterns, rapid advancement, followed by stillness. The distance, physical, temporal, and perceptual. And through all of that, something subtle began to emerge. Not contradiction, but perspective. Because what we've really been exploring is not just the moon landing itself, but the relationship between an event and the way it is understood. And that relationship is not static, it evolves. Not because the facts change, but because we do. Our tools change, our knowledge expands, our expectations shift. And with each shift, the way we see the same event can feel slightly different. Now, take a moment and step back from all of it. Not to analyze, not to question, just to observe. The moon is still there, unchanged in its orbit, silent, distant. The footprints left by those missions are still there too, undisturbed, unaltered, a record that exists outside of human memory, outside of interpretation. And yet, everything we know about those footprints comes to us through layers, through images, through data, through explanation. And that's not a flaw. That's simply how knowledge works, especially when it reaches beyond the boundaries of everyday experience. So what does that leave us with? Not uncertainty in the dramatic sense, but awareness. An awareness that understanding something fully is not always about adding more information. Sometimes, it's about recognizing the space between information, the space where interpretation lives, the space where curiosity begins. And maybe that's why the moon landing continues to hold attention. Not because it is unresolved, but because it sits at a perfect intersection, a place where fact and perception meet, where certainty and distance coexist, where something can be both known and still feel mysterious. And that kind of mystery is not something to eliminate, it's something to appreciate, because it reminds us that even in a world filled with information, there are still moments that invite us to slow down, to look again, to think a little more deeply, not to find a different answer, but to understand the same answer in a richer way. So tonight, as this comes to a close, you don't need to arrive at a conclusion. You don't need to resolve every question. You can simply hold the story as it is, layered, complex, grounded, and yet still quietly intriguing. And maybe, as you drift off, or as your thoughts begin to settle, you'll notice that the most lasting part of this isn't any single detail. It's the way of looking, the habit of pausing, of asking, of exploring without rushing to decide. Because that way of looking extends far beyond this story. It follows you into everything else, every idea, every moment, every piece of information that feels complete, until you look just a little closer. And when you do, there's always something more to see, not hidden, not concealed, just waiting, in the quiet space between what you know and what you're still discovering.